They abandon her the way storms abandon a coastline, all fury and promise at first, then an abrupt, shaming quiet that left wreckage to be sorted out by whoever survived. That opening line could have been the end of Meera Hoverson's story, but for the stubborn, quiet fact that some people are not finished when everybody else decides they are finished with them. Meera was small when it began, smaller perhaps than anyone who later measured her in achievements would remember. Born into a house where loyalty was currency and reputation, a vault door everyone rattled before bed. Her mother had been the kind of woman who made lists and lit candles on birthdays whether anyone showed up or not. Her father was a man who measured love by the ledger of advantages he could not afford to lose. The Hoversons had status in the old town, a riverside house with flaking white paint, a law office with brass letters, holiday windows arranged like theater scenes. They were the family people watched when they wanted a lesson in how to make a life look inevitable, cook inevitable. Meera, for all this, was inconvenient, headstrong, loud in ways their manners considered unladylike, fond of a certain reckless empathy that translated, in their ledger, into unpredictability. When the scandal happened, an old legal case resurfacing with new accusations, a cousin's misdeeds that needed someone to shoulder the social cost, a brother's misstep that required a sacrificial narrative, the family chose the neatest story that would preserve their doors and their dates. Meera had always been a disappointment, they said. She had chosen the wrong man at 20, had burned a bridge by telling a truth too loud, had been an embarrassment at the wrong party. The accusations were a carpet of petty things amplified into a single verdict. She was the leak to be stopped. They abandoned her that autumn with suitcases that looked like arguments and a few polite hollow calls from people who would later say they had been unaware of the ugliness. They left her at the edge of town with a single suitcase of bruised resolve and a single last gift from her mother, a leather-bound recipe book, its pages stained with more than food. Notes in the margins about fortitude. An old family saying, a fragment of a lullaby. Meera walked away with the book like a map she hadn't yet learned to read. For months, the world was a ledger of deprivations and small, furious improvisations. She took a job washing pots, then a bar shift under neon lights where the order of drinks taught her the velocity of people's evenings and the lies they were willing to tell before dawn. She slept on a cot in an apartment that smelled of lemon oil and other people's regret, and learned to move through rooms with the economy of a woman who had been told her life had been canceled. Yet there was a kernel in her that refused the cancellation, not stubbornness for its own sake, but a curiosity that refused to accept that every door in the world would remain closed to her because her family had shut one. Fool. She read the recipe book and found not only directions for soups and pie crusts, but marginalia. When the oven is right, you will know the time to open the door, her mother had written in a cramped hand. Meera kept that line like prayer. She began, absurdly at first, to cook for people. A neighbor with a cough paid with a broken clock. A woman with a newborn traded a knitted scarf. A truck driver tipped with a cassette tape of songs Meera had never heard. Food became the medium through which she built a ledger she intended to keep. Kindnesses accrued, favors exchanged, wrong impressions corrected with the gentle diplomacy of a good stew. By the time winter thawed into a tentative spring, Meera had a small following, the kind of loyal word-of-mouth network that could be counted in dinners and in the quiet returns of people who had once been strangers. But comebacks are rarely linear and never clean. The Haversons, who had divested themselves of rumor carefully, watched the slow development of Meera's reputation like a patient who has been told not to panic when a fever rises. At first, they dismissed the soups and the community dinners as the temporary vanity of a girl in the wrong place. Then the local paper, a column that usually recorded garden parties and city council spats, wrote, almost apologetically, about a woman who had opened a small, improvised kitchen and was feeding people on her own terms. The piece was not kind to the Halversons. People began to ask questions. Why had a woman with a Halverson name been left with nothing? And what did it mean that she was now the one catching the town stray and hungry? Questions became whispers. Whispers became social invitations that could not be politely refused because Meera used each invitation as a stage. She cooked at charity balls. She cooked for the homeless. She offered to teach a cooking class at the community center and then donated half the proceeds to a legal fund for women whose complaints had historically been silenced. Her kitchen ethic was radical. She refused the currency of silent gratitude and asked for accountability instead. She taught people to name what had been done to them while teaching them to measure flour by eye. Her food tasted of places she'd been and decisions she'd made. Her pies had a blunt honesty to them that the town found unexpectedly healing. Slowly, inexorably, Meera became the moral center no one had expected her to be. But a comeback story without pain is a sugarless one. The Halversons, who had cultivated a certain social immunity, began to feel the cold of public opinion. Invitations were returned with apologies. Business partners reconsidered contract. The law firm that had once been a bastion of unquestioned influence found people preferring to consult the woman who had been cast out. It is important to understand that revenge in Meera's case was never the cartoonish vengeance enacted with knives and blackmail. It was surgical, relentless, and astonishingly generous. She built an economy around openness. Legal clinics funded by dinner proceeds, public forums where past injustices were cataloged and current ones named. A scholarship for girls from houses like hers to learn trades that would make them hard to discard. Her revenge made the family mechanism that had discarded her visible and inefficient. It required transparency in ways the Halversons had not anticipated. Their ivory tower, built on silence, began to erode because people began to prefer the person who broke bread for them to the family who had always measured themselves by appearances. At the heart of the story is a smaller, more tender revenge, the reclamation of identity. Meera's brother Jonas, who had been the linchpin of her exile, the convenient deflector of blame, watched as the town's estimation of him subtly shifted. He had believed he could protect himself by discarding someone inconvenient. He had believed the ledger could always be balanced by the sacrifices of those with less power. But power has the curious habit of revealing its own terrors. The more Jonas attempted to smooth the ripples, the more people asked rude questions at the right moments. Meera, though, never publicly gorged on his humiliation. She learned the exquisite discipline of letting consequences arrive like weather, inevitable, natural, not gleeful. At a public hearing about a community redevelopment project, where the Halversons lobbied to preserve a tax structure in their favor, Meera delivered a speech that was both a testimony and an intercession. She did not shout. She told small stories, of a woman who had received a warm bowl of soup and the courage to leave an abusive marriage, of a young man who had been taught to bake and found steadiness in work, of a teenager who had gotten a scholarship because a woman who had been abandoned refused to become bitter. For us to become bitter. Her voice was steady. The microphone amplified nothing but the truth. The town listened because by then Meera had a credibility that came from the slow accumulation of small facts. People fed, people trained, people helped. Her epic comeback, what reporters would later call the miracle of reinvention, was built from that steady work, but it required an architectural turn. An act of strategy Meera carried out with careful, almost domestic cunning. She purchased with her savings and donations a small, shuttered bakery that had once been a Halverson investment and reopened it as a cooperative. The Halversons watched from across the river as the sign went up with her name on it. That moment crystallized everything: ownership, public visibility, the literal setting of a table where the family had once set terms. The cooperative was democratic. Its profits were shared. Its governance included people the Havorsons had disregarded. More than that, Meera's bakery became a legal hub. Pro bono meetings took place at noon. Contracts were read over coffee. Neighbors found affordable counsel in the language of pies and persistence. Meera's revenge here was not to humiliate, but to democratize. She had learned through exile that power retained by a few decays and power redistributed tends to build communities that weather better. In the bakery, the old ledger was rewritten. Of course, there were private moments of reckoning. Meera's mother, who had once written recipes like liturgy, came to the bakery in the way older people come to undoings they don't know how to apologize for. She stood by the counter, fingers tracing the chipped ceramic, and the two women, mother and daughter, survivor and survivor maker, had a conversation that was not a tidy reconciliation, but an unmasking. Her mother apologized in the way some people can manage, with logistics and history and a sentence that kept breaking. Meera recognized the gesture for what it was: partial, bound by the grammar the Halvorsons knew, and accepted and declined in turns. There was a long arc of forgiveness in Meera's chest, one that the world did not obligate her to give or to withhold. She made a choice that surprised everyone who had cataloged her as unpredictable. She did not publicly humiliate her mother, nor did she accept a return to the old dynamics. Instead, she proposed a liturgy of labor. Her mother could teach a baking class. In exchange, she would sit with the cooperative board and listen to the people the family had once dismissed. It was not a magnanimous stroke meant to demonstrate moral superiority. It was a practical experiment in whether people who had erred could learn new behaviors when exposed to accountability. That small decision rippled. A neighbor was heard. A story changed. A Haverson donation was redirected to a flood relief fund as conditional on transparency. It was in its way more devastating than any public shaming because it rewired the family's internal economy. People responded to Meera's comeback in multitudinous ways. Some were elated and generous. Others accused her of capitalizing on victimhood. There were articles that attempted to simplify the plot into a rom-com of redemption and revenge, but the texture of Meera's life resisted simplification. She had lovers along the way who were complicated and sometimes useful. She had friends who were not friends at all. She had moments of entrepreneurial genius and moments of abject, humiliating failure. Ruined cakes, misjudged expenditures, nights when the cooperative's board nearly dissolved and petty infighting. None of that made for the tidy crescendo newspapers love, but it made for a version of life that was more durable. Real problems encountered solved, and sometimes simply managed. The town, meanwhile, shifted in ways that could be measured. A decline in certain exclusive social events, an uptick in civic participation, a recalibration of who sat on boards and why. The Halvorsons were reduced to being studied as a case in a new syllabus at the local university: families and the politics of reputation. Meera found the irony of her family's lectures amusing and sometimes bitter. She sometimes went to sit in the back of the lecture hall and listen, feeling like a ghost among the living. There was inevitably a crisis that tested the architecture she'd built, a lawsuit brought by a developer who saw the cooperative as an obstacle to a planned luxury complex that would re-privatize riverside views. The legal fight was a gauntlet, expensive, draining, full of the ugly kinds of leverage the Haversons had once used. Meera had to marshal everything she'd learned: the community she'd nourished, the legal funds she'd helped set up, the brave testimonies of people whose lives had been altered by a bowl of soup or a scholarship. The courtroom became both theater and field hospital. Meera watched as the town's past decisions and present courage were weighed by a judge who, in a private moment, told her that he had grown up eating her bread. The ruling that finally came down was not an unvarnished victory. It required concessions and long periods of negotiated compromises. but it protected the cooperative and established precedent. Public interest could, under certain circumstances, override private designs. When the decision was announced, the bakery's floor seemed to exhale with the relief of a held breath released. People cried openly on tables. Meera stood among them, tasting victory like the first slice of warm bread saved for the one who had kneaded the dough. Time, which had once been a tool of her abandonment, became Meera's ally. She aged into the life she had created, and with age came the capacity to look back without the immediate sting, to narrate without obsession. She became a mentor to young organizers who wanted to unlearn old models of exclusion. She wrote a book, not a manifesto, but an autobiography with recipes folded into it. The margins held the kind of practical wisdom her mother had given her, but seasoned with the brutalities of experience. The Haversons did not disappear. They existed now as a family that had been scaled down by choice and by consequence. In private, there were moments of reconciliation that were not celebrated with press releases. A holiday dinner where a seat was left empty but acknowledged. A careful negotiation about a property line that prevented endless litigation. A small amidation. A small, stilted conversation between Meera and Jonas about whether the ledger was something to be balanced or buried. Meera's revenge had been neither a blaze nor a whisper. It had been a long, steady choreography of making the world less hospitable to secrecy. It changed everything, not because it humiliated a family, but because it rewired the social expectations around whom communities protect and whom they discard. In the end, the story most people remembered was not of vindication, but of reconstruction. The bakery that became a town hall, the recipe book that became a legal framework, the woman who had been abandoned and then taught the town how to be better caretakers of one another. Meera's life did not arrive at a place of quiet perfection. She had regrets in matters of love, in moments when she had been too proud to ask for help, and she paid their price privately. But she had, in the most honest way possible, changed the terms of belonging. She proved that a single person, given a few tools and a refusal to be erased, could build structures that made being human less hazardous. No. When people asked her how she kept going through the nights of worry, she pointed to the inside cover of her mother's recipe book, a tiny notation, almost invisible now, that read, "Make room for the people who will stay." She had made room, and that was the simplest and most subversive revenge of all. To ensure that nobody else in her town would have to be abandoned with a suitcase and a lie. If that was an epic comeback, it was epic because it remade not only one life, but the architecture of a small community's conscience, and because it taught, in the most practical language of dough and law and shared tables, that dignity is the most contagious thing there is.